and the chief of the IT parliamentary panel. Joining me right now, Shashi Tharoor. Good evening, Mr. Tharoor. Thank you so much for speaking to us here on the Urban Debate. I want to start off by what the government's response has been, which is essentially outright dismissing the Pegasus reports. In fact, Amit Shah has gone on to say that this is nothing but a move by disruptors and obstructors that includes your party as well. Your response to that?
Well, it seems to me this is a very serious matter, because what has apparently happened is that the Pegasus spyware, which is supposed to be there to track terrorists and criminals, and which the company NSO says they only sell to governments vetted by them and approved by the Israeli government. This was apparently used to hack smartphones belonging to journalists, human rights activists, politicians, at least one so-called constitutional authority. So the implication is that either the government is snooping on its own citizens, including many who are going about their own lawful business, and that's obviously very serious, or that that something else has gone wrong. You know, we're a democracy and the rule of law prevails. No one would object to the government intercepting communications to track terrorists or to prevent crimes, but private citizens, including opposition politicians, including the so-called obstructionists, enjoy a fundamental right to privacy. The Supreme Court has affirmed that in its Puttaswamy judgment. So here you've got a situation where apparently the ruling party is using taxpayers' money and is actually buying software to obtain information on its political opponents, which is what the targeting of Rahul Gandhi and Prashant Kishore suggests. And if that is true, that would be unethical, a major misuse of taxpayers' money for partisan political purposes. It's not the ruling party's money, it's a government's money paid for by all taxpayers. And it would also be illegal because in our country, there are very clearly established procedures, rules, laws, under which very specific kinds of interception are legally permitted and have been conducted by all governments. But there are reasons, national security, national sovereignty, and so on. You can't just go and hack someone's device. That's not permitted by law. Now, the other possibility is that our government didn't do it, as they have implied with their statements, if our government didn't do it, somebody has done it, because devices owned by Indians on the list, the database that has leaked, have been tested, and in, I think, 7 or 9 cases have been confirmed to have been contaminated with the Pegasus virus. So if our government didn't do it, some other government must have done it, because only governments have the software, in which case, is it not an even more grave matter of national security? If an unfriendly government is snooping on our political leaders and others, shouldn't our government in India want to find out the truth and want to conduct an independent investigation? That's precisely what we're calling for.
But Dr. Tharoor, do you really believe that there could be any other entity behind this? There is something else that has gone wrong? I mean, of the many reports that have emerged of these names or as potential targets, a lot of those name additions are linked to specific developments, general elections, state political developments. The timing of it is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully heard the question, but you know, obviously I take anything the government says very seriously. The government says there's no unauthorized surveillance, so if we take them at their word, the question that automatically arises is, has there been authorized surveillance? But if there has been authorized surveillance, then on what basis was it authorized? Because I mentioned earlier, the law is very clear. There are very specific criteria: national security, integrity of the nation, sovereignty, and so on, and the right to prevent a crime such as a terrorist attack and so on. But when those reasons are given, and then you see the names of those whose phones have been hacked, it's extremely difficult to reconcile the two. There are no national security or terrorist implications to 40 journalists going about their job, or editors of journals, or indeed a political strategist for Mamata Banerjee's election campaign, or indeed the then leader of India's largest opposition party. It's very difficult to see any legal basis on which this could have been authorized. So if it was authorized, the authorization is unjustifiable, unsustainable, and low. If it was not authorized, then it's illegal. And if governments are the only ones capable of installing it, this Pegasus software, then either the Indian government did it or foreign governments must have done it. And that to me, my mind as an Indian citizen, is an even more worrying concern. So the question is extremely clear. We need an independent inquiry to put people's minds at rest. I think the Indian public deserve that. This is such a serious development. I believe the ideal inquiry would be conducted by an independent sitting judge of the Supreme Court, who would have not only the right to summon people and see classified documents and any other and talk to witnesses, but would also have the judicial capacity to weigh the evidence and come to conclusions. So that's one possibility. There's also the parliamentary committee. I happen to chair the parliamentary committee on IT, and we have on our agenda citizens' data protection, security, data privacy, cyber security. These are all items on our official approved agenda. And we have on this basis actually had a hearing on Pegasus 2 years ago when there was the first reports of a number of Indian citizens having their accounts breached through WhatsApp by the Pegasus virus. So we have the mandate to do it, but I do believe that a judge might get farther. And of course, any parliamentary committee consists of MPs who are all political people, and that has obvious, shall we say, connotations, because politicians naturally would be inclined to ally with their own parties and their own political interests. So a judge, over and above all of this, might be the right way to go.
So I'm glad you brought up that part about the parliamentary panel and wanting to discuss it again, because like you said, in 2019 as well, the parliamentary panel had decided, you went ahead and heard some of the victims of the alleged spyware attack out at that time. But what happened to it?
We frankly couldn't get anywhere in terms of a satisfactory conclusion. The broader subject is still being discussed, and until we write a report and submit it to Parliament, I'm not at liberty to tell you what the report will contain. But I think the very fact that nothing has come out of it so far is I think, clear that the process has its challenges and limitations. We summon witnesses, we ask them questions, and they will respond as they see appropriate. But you know, what's interesting about all of this is going beyond the question of the parliamentary committee, is that some roughly 100 Indian names, I gather, have been identified. This cuts across many professions. It's not only politicians. In fact, politicians outnumbered by your profession, the journalists. It seems to me that one of the things we could do, or the independent inquiry could do, is to actually ask these people, ask all of them, first of all, whether they'd be willing to have their phones submitted for analysis, forensic analysis. Some of them don't have the phones that were being used at that time, Rahul Gandhi, for example. Others may still have the phones. And some may be willing and some may not be willing. I understand that the lady and her family in the Gogoi case are not willing to submit their phones for analysis. So if that's the case, people's rights not to do that must also be respected. That's part of the privacy right. But those who are willing, if you can get a representative sampling, let's say there are 100 names and you get 10 or 15 phones, that gives you a good basis to see whether they've all indeed been breached. Because right now, one of the arguments being made is that merely having their phone numbers on a list doesn't mean that they were hacked. And indeed, the best way to prove they were hacked is by actually analyzing their phones.
No, I agree with you. I mean, there is definitely a need for a proper investigation for us to even find out the truth. But the question, Dr. Tharoor, is who's going to do it?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a parliamentary committee doesn't have the tools to do a forensic analysis. The Supreme Court can actually order the police or the Home Ministry to conduct that. So that's not difficult. Or even go to a private lab and have it analyzed. I mean, a Supreme Court judge or even a judicial commission of inquiry under the Commission of Inquiries Act would have rights to do certain things like that and direct agencies of the state. that I think will be more difficult for a parliamentary committee to do.
Okay, I also wanted to ask you about, one of the arguments that BJP is making where they cite this RTI response. It's a 2013 RTI response, a story that came out in 2018, which talks about 9,000 snooping orders that were given by the UPA in 2013, including looking into emails, etc. Now, so the BJP is saying, why are your party, being hypocritical now by creating all these noise when you know that legal interceptions take place?
Yeah, so the fact is that those are the so-called authorized interceptions. They are indeed recorded. That's why the UPA government's interceptions, which are all lawful, are recorded and can be conveyed through an RTI inquiry. In all of these cases, a reason has to be given. There has to be a process in which a committee approves it. And then there has to be a time limit. Under the law, it's, if I remember right, 2 months initially, extendable up to 6 months and no more than that. Now, that kind of thing has been done by previous governments, and I dare say is done by all governments around the world. And as long as it's following the legal procedure, I don't see any particular problem. The difficulty in the Pegasus case is twofold. Number one, as I mentioned to you earlier, that kind of legal authorized interception is very difficult to justify if you match the exceptions permitted by law and the identities of those on that list. So there is a disconnect. The second problem with the question of this is that if the government denies it, then it was not authorized, so there won't be a record of it. It will be unauthorized. And if it's unauthorized, the illegality of that is also mind-boggling. So these are the questions that I think we really do need to focus on. And as I say, an independent inquiry, a serious investigation would be called for, because otherwise no Indian citizen can consider herself safe in the face of this, apparently this government's very intrusive long arm of the law. And I can't even say long arm of the law, because this may actually be against the law, what has happened.
All right, Dr. Tharoor, since I have you here with me today, I have to also ask you about this other big story that's been, talked about, which is the Kerala government's decision to ease the COVID restrictions for 3 days on account of Eid, despite the fact that Supreme Court said what it did in this case. Do you think it was the right move for Kerala government to still go ahead?
I don't envy the government the challenge of balancing the sensitivities of communities on the one hand, and the absolute vital importance of upholding COVID protocols on the other. Clearly, they got the balance wrong, because in this particular instance, there was every danger that the way in which this was unfolding could really result in a further spike in infections in a state that is already the highest in the country right now. So it is a most unfortunate set of circumstances. And the Supreme Court has today rapped the government of Kerala on the knuckles for having made the decisions they made, or made the choices they have. I gather they said that most merchants and so on had already stocked up their goods for Eid in advance, and it's only fair to allow them to sell it, or the economy would not only be hurting, but also the individual merchants would suffer, etc. I don't presume to be able to sit in judgment on all this. That's what we elect governments to do. But I think the Supreme Court has made it very clear to them that they got it wrong on this.
All right, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, thank you so much for joining us and taking all of our questions. Really appreciate you taking the time out.
Thank you very much. Take care. All the best.